Unless you've been hiding under a rock, compensators have been becoming popular on carry guns. Parker Mountain Machine with their JTTC Micro comp has been a staple on guys who spend too much money on their carry guns across the internet and Instagram. To PMM's credit, they make a great product. Sig Sauer, not to be left out, figured a way to make the slide act as a compensator with their P365XL Spectre comp, which is the XLSC because that's way too long a name. So today we're comparing the Gucci Gun Cork Sniffer compensated carry gun versus the Gucci Gun Cork Sniffing compensated carry gun with a challenge coin. Are you ready? Stand by. Welcome back to the Humble Marksman channel, the only gun channel here on YouTube that slaps as hard as Toto's Africa. Played by monster trucks. So this is the P365XL from Sig Sauer, and this is a plain Jane P365X wearing the PMM JTTC Micro. That's a hard acronym to say, guys. JTTC Micro Comp. That stands for Joint Tactical Technical Compensator. That's not really what it stands for, but some of you guys get really tilted when I say acronyms wrong, so that's for you. It stands for just the tip compensator. So the question remains, does the JTTC Micro Comp work better than the XLSC? Now the XLSC is a pretty cool piece of tech. There's only a 3.1 inch barrel in what would otherwise be a 3.7 inch gun, and the compensating bit isn't even fixed to the barrel. So does the new hotness outperform the staple, the tried and true OG of the micro comps? So that's what we're going to find out here today. We're going to put it on slow motion. We're going to look at hits on target. We'll talk about the gas coming off, and I'll crown a winner like you guys actually care what I think.
Not my favorite thing to do, but not terrible.
But first, if you're new around here, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm trying to get 100,000 subscribers this year in 2022, and if you would help me in that quest, I'd be very grateful. And if you like content like this, check out my Patreon page. I'm making this video specifically because someone who pays me $3 a month said, I'd really like to know how the XLSC stacks up against the micro comp. So I spent $700 to find out. So thank you to all my Patreon supporters. I appreciate you very much. No jabs at the manual reviewer today, but I'm still gonna hit manual reviews simply so you can watch what a legitimate media enterprise talking about guns looks like. Since this is the internet and everybody wants to know how much things cost, because if I don't tell you, then you'll ask it in the comments, I'll tell you anyway. The PMM, if you were to build this up the cheapest way possible, the best way to do it is to spend about $700 buying a P365X, then buying the comp and barrel from Parker Mountain Machine for about $360. And at that point, you would have the Romeo Zero sight and you would have a compensator on your gun for about $1,100 plus or minus. If you were to try and like piece it together, just buying all the parts a la carte, then you'd end up spending more than that because the magazines that come with these guns are stupid expensive. Meanwhile, the XLSC, as you see it here, is $1,100 with no optic, same two magazines, but it comes with a challenge coin. I know how you fellas feel about challenge coins. Before we get further, let's talk about how these things are supposed to work. So this is a 3.1 inch barrel, but it's a threaded barrel, so it's closer to like 3.5 inches. It's a very short threaded barrel, and the compensator threads onto there, and it's basically a one-way trip. So if I want to take the gun apart to clean it, this compensator is not coming off without a ton of effort, and some of you guys who really like cleaning guns, every time you go to the range, you're not going to want to take this apart. It's just too big a hassle. So the way that this works is the gas that propels the bullet out of the barrel ends up hitting the baffle at the front of the slide and being directed up. So the gas that would usually contribute to the rearward motion of the slide coming out of the barrel, that's a fun word called ejecta. That's what you call the projectile and the gas coming out of the barrel. Rather than the ejecta coming out of the barrel this way, it comes out this way and this way, so there's less recoil to contend with. And in theory, that's going to make the guns a little bit more tame when you're shooting. The XLSC, this is kind of neat. When you run the slide back, you can see it's got this short little itty bitty barrel, and that's because there's no compensator threaded on the slide. Instead, what Sig has done is they've milled ports into the slide, and rather than the barrel mating up with the tip of the muzzle of the slide, that mating surface is further back in here just behind the window cuts. So it's still locking up like a 3.1 inch gun. It just has extra slide hanging off the front of the barrel, and that is going to end up acting as a baffle. So rather than the ejecta going down the barrel and out, some of it is hit on the baffle and directed up, so the recoil is reduced. And it absolutely works. If you haven't seen my review on the little gun, I was really surprised how well the thing works. It's actually really cool.
Wow, it works.
So before we got started, since these are self-defense guns, I decided to take my handy dandy lab radar, which is one of the things I can link you in my description. So there is a Amazon link to the lab radar, the finest chrono you can get. So if you want one of those, I'd appreciate it if you could check that out. But I took these and I put them on the chrono. Now, first thing I did was I used my 365XL, which is my everyday carry gun, to set a benchmark on velocity. Tested then both of the other guns. Predictably, with 5 shots shooting white box ammunition, and before we go a lot further, guys, I do need to explain that when you shoot a gun, it is a system. It is the combination of the gas coming out of the barrel as much as it is the projectile that works the whole recoil mechanism and makes the gun work. So I was using Winchester white box, so all of the testing you're about to see is applicable only to that specific load. I have shot both these guns using other factory loaded ammunition. The results are similar, but not exactly the same as. That'll be important later. My regular 365XL averaged an 1168 using Winchester white box coming out of the gun. So next I shot the XLSC, and predictably it was slower because it has a shorter barrel. But it didn't lose as much velocity as I would have thought. It came up at 1139 foot per second. Well, if it was 1139, I thought for sure the Parker Mountain machine, which has a longer barrel, would have higher velocity. It didn't. It was actually slower. It was the slowest of the barrels. Now, keep in mind, barrels are a finicky thing, and some barrels are faster, some barrels are slower. You can have the exact same gun, and the barrels will be different speeds when you put them on the chrono. So, I'm not saying that all of the barrels are going to be slow, but this barrel was slower. Despite being longer, in theory, it should have gotten better velocity. This barrel came up at 1126, so 13 foot per second slower than the XLSC. I also noticed the slide didn't lock back when the magazine was empty. That's called foreshadowing. So moving on, I went to a 5-shot rapid fire string at about 10 yards as fast as I can pull the trigger. And because we're men of science here on the Humble Marksman channel, we shot the control gun first. The entire point of this drill is to shoot the gun faster than I believe I could return the sights to 0, just to see how much recoil affected the gun. So the grouping wasn't great, but it was acceptable. And next I shot the XLSC. And immediately what I noticed, the sensation in hand of recoil was less, and as a result the group shrank. And finally with the PMM, the recoil sensation was even less, but the group was roughly the same size as the XLSC, which is to say smaller than the control group. You'll also notice the slide didn't lock back. Next, we're looking at the gun's recoil in slow motion. What we're seeing is if there's a faster cycle time, because the whole point of a compensated gun is you can get the slide to cycle a little bit faster, and in theory, the compensator is going to help it settle out of recoil faster. Looking at the guns in slow motion, I don't really notice a big difference. Both the muzzle rise, return, the amount of oscillations once the slide closes, it's roughly the same. It's the same as a control, but I can tell you that the feeling of shooting the guns, the compensated guns, absolutely are more pleasant to shoot. One thing that is worth noting about watching the guns in slow motion is the brass ejection on the PMM equipped gun. You'll notice the brass is a little bit sluggish getting out of the chamber, and it's hitting the glass of my optic pretty regularly. Yes, there is space for a "that's what she said" joke here, so feel free to use it. Moving on, I didn't think much of it. The brass was not being thrown out of the barrel quite as lively, but again, this is a system of ammunition, so there's that. Moving on from there, I shot doubles, which is 1 sight picture, then 2 rapid pulls of the trigger. And the whole point is to run the trigger as fast as possible to see where the gun is coming back at my natural cyclical rate. As fast as I can pull the trigger, where's the second shot showing up? I was not very scientific with this, and I shot the XLSC first. And after kind of a flyer on the first shot, I settled into recoil, and the gun's second shot came down acceptably close, and this was 7 to 10 yards. I can't remember the distance I shot at. The PMM shooting it afterwards, I was already dialed in, and the shots came back super accurately, and it was at this point I realized that the PMM comp absolutely is more efficient and working better. But you'll also notice the slide doesn't lock back. Then all of a sudden, remembering we're men of science, I shot the control gun, and predictably all of the second shots came down significantly lower. When you get used to shooting a compensated gun, it takes time to go back to a non-compensated gun and adjusting kind of your grip at kind of a micro level. So I was not able to return the gun like I would have when I was shooting compensated guns all day. And finally, for all you gunfighters, I shot the gun from Peck Index just to see how the gun shot and see how much compensator blast I was going to take in the face. While it wasn't my favorite thing to do, neither one of the guns really bothered me all that much.
Not my favorite thing to do, but not terrible.
But what I did notice shooting the PMM gun is that the slide not locking back issue, the brass to the glass issue I was facing, well, you can induce limp-wristed malfunctions.
Peck Index PMM. Oh, there's a... Had a jam. Let's try that again. All right, here we go. Peck Index. Again with that. That's interesting. Probably the comp's taking too much gas off it and I'm limp wristing a little bit at the peck. That's not my favorite thing to do. But again, that's interesting.
And as a result, I was able to reliably induce stovepipe malfunctions. So because we're men of science as well as being a legitimate media enterprise, I tried to induce limp wrist malfunctions just shooting at the target.
Induce malfunctions, nothing there? Ah! Yep, there it is. Yep, forced a double feed after that too. Check the XLSC out for limp wristing issues. Nothing. It's kicking brass out like a champion. It's a little bit jumpier.
That's not saying anything about the compensator. In fact, the compensator is amazing. It does a better job than the XLSC. It's just that the performance envelope in which this is reliable does not feature 115 grain projectiles loaded at target velocities. You would need to be shooting something much hotter in order to get reliable ejection, which is why it was having stovepipe malfunction issues. That is not a knock in any way on this design. The only other factor that we could really talk about is that this has the little itty bitty 3.1 inch recoil system that has a really strong spring, whereas this has the 3.7 XL size recoil spring. I don't know how that factors in, but I do know in 1911s, the shorter barreled ones are harder to make work than the longer barreled ones. So that probably has something to do with it too. So what are your options if you decide really the PMM is the way that you want to go? Well, you've got a couple options. Number one, shoot hotter ammo. You can shoot a NATO spec loaded 115s for practice, which isn't much more than regular target loaded ones. You can shoot 124s loaded at NATO spec. Because the compensator is more efficient, it's probably not going to be wildly different from what a factory load would feel like in a non-compensated gun. That's kind of the point of a compensator, is you can shoot spicier ammo and it feels like more tame ammunition. Number two is you could change recoil springs. And the recoil spring, the only one that I'm aware of, that's not to say they're not out there, I just am not aware of it, is the DPM system does offer a recoil spring assembly that allows you to tune your recoil spring weight. Now, if you want to shoot weaker ammunition, you would need a lighter spring rate. So something that cycles lighter than whatever the factory spring rate is. Problem is those DPM springs are like $100. Nobody ever said this was a cheap hobby. Meanwhile, if the XLSC, I can tell you it doesn't vent gas as efficiently, but it absolutely does knock it down a percentage. But if you look at all the footage, the brass that's throwing out there using the same ammunition is thrown much, much further. So when I get to the point of the video, when I actually pick which gun that I would personally choose to carry between these two options, it would be the XLSC, and it's for a couple reasons. Number one, the ammunition window of performance is much larger. If I can shoot target loads out of the gun and not have to worry about malfunctions, that's generally going to be better boding for if I'm shooting like standard pressure defensive loads and I get one that is undercharged from a powder perspective. I'm less likely to have to worry about a stovepipe type malfunction if I'm firing from like a compromised position, like Peck Index. Number two is there is no compensator affixed to the barrel. So if I want to take the gun apart to clean it, it's just like every other gun. And I can take the gun apart and the barrel comes right out and I can clean out all the nastiness that is this compensation type chamber and be off to the races. The other reason that I like this a little bit better is that if I use a low mount optic like say the Romeo Zero Elite, which check back to the channel, I'll have a review on this in a few more weeks, but I can use a low mount sight like the Holosun K series, the Romeo Zero from Sig, the RMSC, any of those types of optics will fit on this cut. And I keep my rear sight so I have a lower third co-witness, which would be my preference for concealed carry. On the X slides, the rear sight goes away when you mount an optic. So if you use a Zero that has a rear sight mounted in and it actually co-witnesses from the front sight, then you're good to go. But if you don't use that optic, then you're kind of out of luck. So please take this purely as data points. I'm not trying to inform or slag the product. The Parker Mountain Machine product is exceptional. It's incredibly well designed. It's incredibly well executed. It is a top shelf product. It just doesn't work with the lower loaded ammunitions. It's too aggressive of a comp for lighter loads like the white box. For many of you, that's going to be totally fine because that's not what you want to shoot out of the gun. That's just what my preference is because I use whatever trash is on the shelf at the local big box store. One day we'll get to pick which ammo we shoot again, lads, but it's not going to be for a couple years. So if you'd like to know more about any of the guns on the channel, specifically the XLSC, you can check out this video. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys on the next one.